The United States has developed some of the most advanced aircraft the world has ever seen. This has arguably been the status quo ever since the Second World War. In fact, most modern American military doctrine centers around establishing dominance of the air. But given that the United States is constantly developing new aircraft, those fallen obsolete have a tendency to pile up, sometimes literally. You see, once a particular type of plane is no longer needed, they are sent across the country to locations known as airplane graveyards to be scrapped, sold, maintained, or just kept dormant. Perhaps the most famous and the largest of these complexes is the airplane graveyard at the Davis-Monthan Base in Tucson, Arizona, which is commonly known as the Boneyard. At this location, there are thousands of planes, with many of them at their final resting place. The Tucson Boneyard is also a massive tourist attraction and pop culture icon, featured in several popular movies such as Transformers, Revenge of the Fallen, and Can't Buy Me Love, both of which were filmed on location. But how did the Tucson Boneyard become so crucial to American aviation disposal, and what are the stories behind the planes here? Today we discover Tucson's Airplane Boneyard. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. The current official name of the Tucson Airplane Graveyard is the 309th Aerospace Maintenance and Regeneration Group. However, the location is often referred to as the Boneyard or AMARG. It is also a large part of the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. Located on the outskirts of the city, it is the resting place for over 4,400 aircraft, making it the largest aviation salvage yard in the entire world. This aircraft junkyard is truly a sight to see, as all the planes are perfectly lined up and organized in exact formation with stereotypical military precision. It is a jarring sight when fully operational planes are set up on aircraft carriers or on an airfield. They are usually given an ample amount of space or organized in such a way as to avoid collisions or damage from other nearby planes and their wingspan. Therefore, it may be somewhat strange to see the tight, unorthodox formations for which the planes at the Boneyard are stored, as these planes now have vastly different procedures and maintenance given that they are no longer in service. In fact, sometimes planes awaiting scrapping are simply stacked directly on top of one another, a sight only seen in scrapyards like these. The area itself also adds to the allure, with the Boneyard sticking out among the sprawling desert. But that's not a coincidence. The desert environment is actually part of the reason why the Boneyard was established here and why it's so widely used. For example, the desert's temperature and dry air make it perfect for the planes so they don't rust. The whole complex was built in the early 1960s as the US military accumulated an excessive amount of aircraft that they were no longer using. Yet the planes themselves were still assets, as many of them held critical parts that may be important in a time of need. Hence, it would not be wise to completely scrap them. On the other hand, it would also be extremely expensive to build massive hangars to house all of these planes. As a result, the military compromised and settled on an outdoor scrapyard. Curiously, before this yard was built in its current form, a much smaller aircraft storage center was actually constructed in its place in 1946, known then as the 4105th Army Air Force Base Unit, and it was originally meant to store many B-29 Superfortresses and Douglas C-47 Skytrains, very large planes that were mostly unneeded as World War II had just ended. By midpoint of that year, the base housed 600 B-29s and over 200 C-47s, but they also temporarily stored about 30 individual planes here, which were specifically maintained and fit for museum use, such as the Enola Gay and the Boxcar. As was said before, this particular location was perfect for housing aircraft as there was little to no rain or humidity, meaning few opportunities for rust to develop. On top of that, the tough alkaline soil was also beneficial as the heavy planes wouldn't sink into the dirt, and it was strong enough that the ground didn't have to be paved. Over time, as the Air Force became its own branch of the U.S. Armed Forces and the number of excess planes increased, the entire complex was expanded and was now open to aircraft from all four branches of the military in 1962. Then, in the next year, the U.S. Department of Defense closed the storage facility in Phoenix, Arizona, and decided to move all the aircraft to Tucson. Interestingly enough, the planes were not flown over like usual, but rather they were transported by truck, which was far cheaper and apparently easier. After the consolidation of multiple branches of the military's planes, the complex was renamed the Military Aircraft Storage and Disposition Center. 2 decades later, the facility was renamed yet again in 1985 after it expanded to house obsolete intercontinental ballistic missiles, and since these missiles aren't planes, it was now called the Aerospace Maintenance and Regeneration Group, as it remains to this day. Well, the place is known as the Boneyard. Not all stockpiles here are completely decommissioned or deactivated. In fact, while some are sold to allied nations, many planes here have been mothballed for future activation, meaning the military has no use for them at the moment, but they may need them later on. This process may seem strange to most, but planes are complex, expensive, and require parts that are not as plentiful as you might imagine. After the Cold War ended, the entire nature of U.S. foreign relations changed from a potential Third World War and nuclear warfare with the Soviet Union to various peacekeeping or regime-changing operations against smaller nations across the world. As a result, the type of warfare and subsequent types of aircraft necessary were no longer the same. However, should a massive conventional war break out, many of the planes at the Tucson Boneyard can be immediately reactivated and refitted for service. As we said before, some planes here are virtually ready for takeoff after a few touch-ups, while others have so many parts taken off and are scrapped and salvaged to the point that they look entirely unrecognizable. And this is a sight that draws people in. Today, the Boneyard actually offers extensive tours of the mass collection, but since it is still part of an active military base, there are several important rules and restrictions prior to entry, perhaps even enhancing the novelty of this very bizarre place. Nowadays, there are numerous types of aircraft stored at the Boneyard, not just airplanes. There are also helicopters, ICBMs, and even space shuttles. In order to manage the over 4,400 aircraft stockpiled here, there are about 500 people employed. When the average plane first arrives at the Boneyard, there is a specific process that each one goes through before they are stored. First, workers go through the paperwork, looking at all the previous upgrades or maintenance, which is important given that some of the aircraft can be as old as 70 years or beyond, meaning that many original parts may have been replaced over the years. Afterwards, the aircraft is then relieved of its arms, which are shipped and stored elsewhere. Other items are also stripped from the planes, such as ejection seats, clocks, or specific classified hardware. So with all these loose materials gone, the plane is then given to a special wash, both inside and out, which is meant to remove any salt. This is especially critical for planes that served in environments with lots of salt in the air, such as on aircraft carriers. Next up, the fuel storage is completely drained. The tanks are flushed out and then refilled with a lightweight oil before being drained again. This oil leaves behind a film which protects the inside of the fuel system. Then the plane's interior is fully sealed off from the outside elements, such as dust, sand, heat, or sunlight, with an array of techniques and covers. One example of this is a white vinyl plastic spray that covers the cockpit, blocking the sunlight from causing either sun or heat damage to the inside. After this whole process is completed, the plane is then towed to its resting place out on the dirt, where it will remain evermore unless otherwise needed. Overall, there are 4 categories of planes being stored at the Boneyard. Category 1000 are the planes that are to be kept in decent condition, as they aren't intended to be used again, but they can be and will be if a crisis-like situation arises. Category 2000 are planes that are only maintained for spare parts and nothing else. While this may seem like a degrading category, the Boneyard's extensive collection means it is sometimes the only spot in the world to get certain parts for specific planes. Category 3000 are planes that are currently not needed but will most likely see service soon. Therefore, these aircraft are kept in ready-to-fly condition. The final category, Category 4000, are the planes that are meant for display only. Given that there are only so many museums or other locations to display planes, and these locations usually only need one or two models, the majority of aircraft in this category will be scrapped for their metal and be turned into razor blades, soda cans, or cars. So now that we've looked at the Boneyard and its history as a whole, let's look at some of the specific types of planes which have been stored here throughout the years or are still currently on display. The B-29 was a truly historic plane and perhaps one of the most famous, iconic models from World War II, where it saw extensive service in the Pacific Theater. The plane itself is a four-engine, propeller-driven heavy bomber designed by Boeing. It was primarily intended for high-altitude bombing campaigns, but as the war went on, it was also used for low-altitude bombing raids at night, in addition to naval mine dropping. The B-29 Superfortress was not only one of the largest planes in the war, but it was also one of the most advanced, utilizing some of the best state-of-the-art technology of the time, such as a pressurized cabin, dual-wheeled tricycle landing gear, a fire control system that was controlled by an analog computer, among other gadgets. Normally, a B-29 Superfortress would be fitted with 1050 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannons, with 4 of the gun turrets being operated by remote control. Furthermore, the plane also had a 10-ton bomb capacity. The B-29 program was actually the most expensive project of the war, costing about $3 billion in total. The heavy price was definitely worth it, however, as the B-29 Fortress was one of the most effective aircrafts of its time. In fact, 2 of these planes played a vital role in history, with the Enola Gay and the Bockscar dropping the atomic bombs on Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, eventually causing the Japanese Empire to surrender. Production was discontinued in 1946 after the war's end, and the military cut back on their massive fleet of B-29s. Some were repurposed into civilian tankers, some were scrapped or sold, but many were mothballed at the Tucson Boneyard. Many would actually later be reactivated with the breakout of the Korean War, until the plane was finally retired in 1960. In fact, both the Enola Gay and the Bockscar were briefly stored at the Boneyard, although they were prepared for museum display and not re-entered into combat. Many other types of bombers from the Cold War era were also stored at the Boneyard at one point. One of these was the B-36 Peacemaker, a strategic bomber from the 1950s. The Peacemaker was actually the first bomber that could carry nuclear weapons without specific modifications, though thankfully no B-36 ever had to deliver this ordnance in combat. Furthermore, the Peacemaker was also the largest plane with a piston engine. And while the Peacemaker never actually saw combat, it was still extremely effective as a deterrent to war, as the Soviet Union were hesitant to act, knowing that the American B-36s carrying nuclear bombs could quickly be flying over Soviet cities if war broke out. By the mid-1950s, the B-36 was made obsolete by the jet-engined Boeing B-52 Superfortress, and it was officially retired in 1959. 384 B-36 planes were then sent to the Boneyard over the years. The entire fleet would be dismantled and scrapped, with the exception of 4, which were maintained for air museums. Speaking of the B-52, there are actually many iterations of this model which have gone through the Boneyard. The B-52 itself is one of the most famous aircraft in U.S. military history, and surprisingly, it's still in service today due to its combat effectiveness and reliability. Overall, it is a massive plane with a bomb capacity of 70,000 pounds, and it saw action in the Vietnam War, the Persian Gulf, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and the War on Terror in Afghanistan. The plane is so useful that the military doesn't expect it to be retired until 2050. However, there have been times after several conflicts where the military has an excess of B-52s and the surplus is sent to the boneyard to be dismantled or scrapped on most occasions. Not all of them are scrapped though, as 12 currently sit in long-term storage and can be reactivated if needed. Another iconic plane which has been stored at the boneyard was the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom, a twin-engine jet interceptor and fighter bomber. With over 5,195 of this model built, the F-4 Phantom has been the most widely produced American supersonic aircraft. The F-4 Phantom was the record-breaking fighter for many reasons, such as its top speed, which exceeds Mach 2. The Phantom can also be armed with 18,000 pounds of ordnance ranging from both air-to-air or air-to-ground missiles, not to mention the M61 rotary cannon. Because of its immense power, the F-4 Phantom was in service for nearly 35 years, being used by the Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps. It also saw a large amount of action in the Vietnam War, as well as the Persian Gulf War. Over time, the F-4 Phantom was phased out by several other fighters by each branch of the military, such as the F-14 Tomcat, the F-15 Eagle, the F-16 Fighting Falcon, and the F-18 Hornet. However, the F-4 Phantom still does see combat today, as it is used by several militaries across the world, such as South Korea, Greece, and Turkey, among others. Since the plane was retired in 1996, many were stored at the Tucson Boneyard, where they were scrapped, mothballed, or sold to allied nations. The last F-14 Phantom in Tucson with the calling sign Last One left in 2013 when it was flown for its final time to California after being repaired at the boneyard. Another famous fighter plane stored in Tucson is the F-14 Tomcat, which was also the same plane that the U.S. Navy replaced the F-4 Phantom with. The Tomcat is a carrier-capable supersonic twin-engine fighter plane that was first introduced into service in 1974 on the aircraft carrier the USS Enterprise. The F-14 Tomcat is one of the most iconic fighters in military history, appearing in many films and television shows, but perhaps it's most known from the 1986 film Top Gun, where it was the fighter plane all the main characters flew. The movie was so popular and influential from a cultural point of view that Navy recruitment skyrocketed, with many viewers feeling so inspired that they wanted to become Navy fighter pilots and fly the F-14s themselves. The F-14 Tomcat even made a key cameo in the groundbreaking sequel, Top Gun: Maverick, which came out in May of this year. There are also numerous F-14 Tomcats stored at the Tucson Boneyard in various states of repair, though there is a somewhat controversial history surrounding this exhibit. In the early 1970s, when the United States and Iran were on good terms, the Iranian military was looking to expand their air force. The U.S. offered either the F-14 or the F-15, but the leader of Iran decided to buy the F-14 as he was personally amazed by its test performance and thought it was immensely superior. However, after the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran quickly became an enemy to the US, with all those F-14s now falling into the new government's hands. Under the Iranian Air Force, the F-14 then saw extensive use in the Iran-Iraq War, where it was utterly devastating to Iraqi forces. Now, because the models which the Iranian government has are from the early 1970s, and they no longer have the US as an ally to resupply them with parts, many suspect that the Iranian government would be desperate to acquire any parts possible to repair and enhance their fleet of F-14s. As a result, the security surrounding the F-14 exhibit and storage at the Tucson Boneyard is particularly tight, so as not to allow any spies in. For over 80 years, this aircraft storage facility has borne witness to some of the most prominent and iconic planes in American military history, offering a unique look at aircraft in a state of stillness or gradual decay. And even as famous planes have come and gone, their legacies will live on. Thank you all so much for watching. Please consider supporting the channel by clicking join or subscribe to catch new videos every Thursday and Saturday. And don't miss our video about the weirdest ships in history. Until next time, This is Ryan Socash, signing off.